I call Dr. Pamji Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to speak on the Child Protection, Child Sex Offender Register Bill's first reading. Mr. Speaker, I would like to acknowledge the Minister in charge, Honourable Anne Tolley, for bringing this bill to the House. Mr. Speaker, this bill will enable establishment of New Zealand's first child sex offender register from July next year, that is July 2016. And this register will enable information sharing among entities dealing with the issue. This register will be established by police and corrections, and once it is set up, then authorized staff members will have access to this register to identify and manage risk posed by convicted child sex offenders when they come to the end of their sentences or those who are serving non-custodial sentences. Mr. Speaker, as we have heard from the Minister and other speakers, this information will not be publicly available, but it will be made available to third parties only if there is a significant risk posed by a convicted registered sex offender, child sex offender, to a child's safety. And this information then will be released to third parties like parents, guardians, or school principals. And Mr. Speaker, convicted child sex offenders over the age of 18 will go on this register. Those who are convicted for committing such crime against children under the age of 16. So if they have been sentenced, or if they are serving non-custodial sentence, or if they have been convicted overseas for a qualifying offence and they come back to live here in New Zealand for more than 6 months, they will be required to go on that register. Mr. Speaker, this register will contain quite a bit of information about the offender, not just the name and the address, but it will have some identifying particulars about the offender. It will also have information about the offence and date of sentencing for the qualifying offence. And so as this register contains extensive information about the offender and also the offence committed, this register is not going to be publicly available. And as I said before, Mr. Speaker, this information will be made available only to third parties or specified agencies if there is a significant risk to a child's safety, overall welfare, or sexual safety. And this bill also covers the suppression order aspect. It is quite common that in these kind of cases, people apply for suppression orders. So, Mr. Speaker, convicted child sex offenders subject to suppression order, their information on this register may also be disclosed to third parties. These convicted child sex offenders on the register, they don't have any restrictions for their usual activities. For Mr. Speaker, if they wish to travel, they will be able to travel, but there will be some reporting requirements. For example, if a convicted child sex offender on the register wants to go away from their usual residential address for more than 48 hours, they will be required to report to the Commissioner. They will be required to provide information about their plan at least 48 hours before they commence their travel. Mr. Speaker, this bill is part of National's big program to keep young people safe from harm. It's important that we look after people. They should feel safe in their homes and communities. It's important that everyone, including young people, are treated with respect and dignity. It's not just about tackling crime. This register is about preventing crime as well. And our focus is to make sure that we are preventing crime from happening in the first place. Mr. Speaker, we know that the crime rate is the lowest in 35 years in New Zealand, and New Zealanders are benefiting from this low crime rate. And this has happened because this national government is hard on criminals. We have toughened prison sentences for gang members. We have stopped release of violent criminals on parole, and also the street racing offences have halved since the new legislation passed. So, Mr. Speaker, this bill is an example of how we are continuing our work to protect our young ones, children in the community. It's important that we protect them from any violent or sexual crime. Our goal is to protect public and to hold offenders accountable. We are using technology, Mr. Speaker. National introduced 24/7 GPS monitoring of high-risk offenders, but this register is going to be useful because this register will allow information sharing among different entities. And this is also about breaking the cycle of reoffending and imprisonment. So the register will help different agencies to keep track of these convicted child sex offenders and to also monitor their circumstances. So our interest is to keep victims safe. Our interest is to make sure that victims are not re-victimized and offenders are not re-offending. And Mr. Speaker, victims should not be always living in the fear that offenders are around them. So parents of children should not be worried about offenders hanging around their house, playgrounds, or schools. So we need to make sure that the system provides that assurance to them that we are keeping track of convicted child sex offenders. And we should be able to protect children from known offenders so children get best possible opportunities to get ahead in life. Children, Mr. Speaker, if they are abused sexually or physically, can take a long time to recover. They may not get back on track for their whole life. They may suffer mentally and physically because of the abuse that they might have faced in their young in the young age. And so, Mr. Speaker, we want to make sure that victims get the right kind of support. First, it's to deal with the aftermath after the crime happens, and also long-term support is also available to help them bring them back on track. So government is ensuring that our focus is on victims. We want to prevent sexual abuse happening against children. And Mr. Speaker, this can be done with the help of communities, parents, schools, and legislations like this one. And it's very sad to see when offenders go out and commit the same crime repeatedly, and victims are re-victimized. So that's where, Mr. Speaker, this bill is going to provide protection for children. Mr. Speaker, at a recent public meeting in Mount Roskill, I spoke about this bill to inform them about this bill coming before the House. And it was quite well received, and there were a lot of positive responses for this bill. We want public to have trust in the system, and that trust will come only if we have right kind of mechanisms in place. So the setup of this sex offender register is a significant step forward to protect children. And another important thing about this bill, Mr. Speaker, is that this bill also establishes offense for people not providing information to go on this register. So if people fail to provide information to go, convicted child sex offenders, they fail to provide information to go on this register, they can be fined for up to $2,000 or can be sent to jail for up to 1 year. And if they provide misleading or wrong information, Mr. Speaker, that is taken even more seriously. They can be fined for up to $4,000 and sent to jail for up to 2 years. Convicted child sex offenders serving a sentence at the time the new legislation comes into force will also go on to this register. So, Mr. Speaker, the aim of this bill is to keep track of convicted child sex offenders, to monitor their circumstances, to see if there is any need for any necessary, any action to be taken. And Mr. Speaker, the information on these convicted child sex offenders will be continually updated. So information will be latest, and because of the type of the information on the register, it is not publicly available. But as I said, Mr. Speaker, earlier, that information will be made available only if there is a significant risk posed by a convicted child sex offender to a child in the community. So, Mr. Speaker, I believe this step will reduce child abuse. So I support this bill and commend the bill to the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.